You are listening to the Mercy Cast, where we are learning the art of compassion through life's adversity. And I'm your host, Raleigh Sadler. Have you ever had these moments in your life where you just felt paralyzed? Like you're trying to move forward, you're trying to do things and be productive and be a productive citizen. But at the end of the day, you're not really getting to where you want to go. This can be really stressful. This can be really frustrating. And not many of us know how to push past it. Richard was working on his mother's memoir for 4 years. Like his mother 25 years earlier, he couldn't write a single word. It was total mental paralysis. Today, I'm joined by Richard Hsung, the editor of Spring Flower, his mother's memoir. Richard, welcome to the Mercy Cast.
Raleigh, thank you so much for having me on your show.
We were talking a little bit earlier about how you are from Madison, Wisconsin, how you are a retired professor at the University of Wisconsin, but you're not necessarily a Midwesterner. There's some Northeast in there, I've noticed.
Sometimes I try to tell people that's not my Chinese accent, that's my Bostonian accent. So I grew up in Boston after my mother brought me over to the States in 1980. And so I lived a little bit in New York City, and then later we settled down in Boston. But then after that, I came to the Midwest. For most part of my life, I've lived in the Midwestern part of America.
And having just spent a little time in the Midwest, I've grown to love it. It's beautiful, but it is so different than the Northeast. And so you seem to be a man of all seasons, to be able to live in all of the places and thrive. And so that's
very different culture. Yeah. But I've come to respect and admire mainly through teaching, because most kids I've taught at University of Wisconsin-Madison or earlier at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, they're all local, right? They're all born and raised in the Midwest. And these are wonderful kids.
And what kind of studies did you teach?
So I taught organic chemistry. And then after I came to Wisconsin, I was mostly at the School of Pharmacy. So I taught medicinal chemistry, talk about drug designs and drug actions and so on. Yeah. So it's very interesting. But chemistry in general.
So chemistry seems like a slight shift to what you're doing now with editing your mother's memoir. How did that happen?
I like the word slight. Yeah, two couldn't have been more different worlds. But actually teaching chemistry and teaching science and writing scientific papers might have helped me transition to completing or editing my mother's memoir. Although again, two are very different beasts. So I started working on my mother's memoir in 2014. And of course, I was still working. But after a while, I realized my mother's memoir took such a toll on me. It was a very exhausting task, and I had to consider maybe quitting my career slightly earlier. I say slightly because by the time I really retired 3 years ago, I've already taught chemistry for almost 3 decades. So it was good. Yeah. So, but I worked on my mother's memoir since 2014. So about 10 years or so, working on her stories of her life, I guess.
Well, we're talking about this idea of mental paralysis, this idea of reaching this glass ceiling and not knowing how to get through it. For you, what was the most difficult thing about writing your mother's memoir?
Reliving the past, dredging up the past. And I think that's why everyone's life is potentially a book-worthy or is book-worthy.
Yeah.
But not everyone would sit down and write a book about their life, dredging up the past. Everyone has a painful moment or painful period in their past. And so reliving that can be detrimental to a person's mental health. And my mother completely underestimated that. And so did I. So after 4 years of going at it, I finally experienced what my mother had experienced 25 years earlier. She fell in deep depression. That's why she couldn't finish her memoir. And it was left there for better part of 2 decades before I picked it up. Yeah.
Yeah, because just putting that on paper makes it real again, right?
Yeah. And as if you just did a time travel back to the 1960s and 70s and or for her 50s, 30s and 40s. Yeah. I mean, there are wonderful moments. There are happy moments where you would love to relive that. But of course, there are plenty of moments where you just wondered, what if?
Well, and how did you process that? Because that sounds like you're facing not only maybe your own trauma in doing this, but your mother's trauma. So now there's just a lot of stuff in play.
Yeah. So I hated her for a while. But of course, it was a promise I made to her, right? So I hated myself for casually promising my mom that I would complete her memoir. And so, yeah, it was difficult because not only I was learning about her past thoroughly, although by that time, by 2014, I've already known her stories, most of her stories. And I had to be reminded of myself, how I grew up, how I spent my first 14 years of my life in China in the 1960s and 70s before we immigrated to the States. And so, yeah, again, as I said earlier, I completely underestimated or ignored. And so to the point where, right, I was falling into depression as well. But lucky for me, I think, unlike my mother, lucky for me, I understood some of this. A newer generation, my mother's generation, or maybe your parents' generation, they frown upon the fact that you would even consider calling up a therapist. And so I did. I called up my therapist 20 some years earlier. She had worked with me for about a good 6, 7 years. So I said to her, Margaret, and luckily she was still practicing. And I said, 25 years earlier, when I called you, I didn't really care if I lived or died. Right. But today I'm calling you because I want to live. And that was, I think, pretty powerful to her too. Because I said to her, I'm trying to complete my mother's memoir. And I just realized I don't want to die for a book. I don't want to die for any books, let alone my mother's memoir, right? So she took me in right away. Yeah, so she started working with me, and that was very helpful. I didn't pick up a pen or didn't pick up my laptop for a good, 10, 11 months before I started typing again.
People underestimate that. When they see authors putting out books, they think, oh, that person just sat down and started typing. That person went into his office or her office and just started working. And no, sometimes there's some counseling there. There's some counselors behind the scenes helping you navigate some of the stories that you're choosing to share with total strangers.
Yeah, the underestimation part was that I never thought about talking to someone who had written a book or any books, right? So I just dived right in, and I thought the same way. Well, you just, like pounding out a research grant or a scientific paper, you just go in there and you work day and night, and then that'll be, voila, here it is, right? So I couldn't be far from the truth. I could be more wrong, about this whole process, right?
Well, no one tells you about what happens after you turn in your manuscript. It's like I had a friend who was friends with another author that I admired, and that person reached out through my friend and said, how's Raleigh doing now that his book's out? Is he okay? If he needs to talk. And I didn't know that there was like this community of writers who are like, nah, like this is part of it. Like this is the birthing process of a dream and getting this thing out there. You're going to go through different seasons. And what I love about your story is you're so honest about that initial sitting down with a book. You do those 4 years and then you hit that wall. You hit this glass ceiling. You can't break through it. What was the rest of that process? How did you how did you start to see light at the end of the tunnel?
So yeah, so after I called up my therapist and she began working with me, and then after about half a year, and she started talking about, of course, our conversations often surrounded my mother's memoir. But then after about 6 or 8 months, she began to ask me what I was thinking if I would pick it up back up again. And no, I said, I still want to live. I think I'm still thinking. And then after a few more months, I have, of course, I have American families, right? So that's part of my American heritage. And actually, the irony is that many of them are accomplished authors. It never occurred to me to call my American cousins up and ask them about writing process. Anyway, they called me up and asked me how the book is going.
Yeah.
And I had to tell them, and they were appalled and they felt very bad for not being there with me or for me. But they were appalled the fact that what I was going through in terms of mentally and emotionally. And then so they began to helping me and looking for editors, publishers, and they say, look, like what you were saying, an author, a writer is an artist, right? So after you paint something on the canvas, whether you like it or you hate it, you have to step back and look at it, or you have to just cover it up and leave it alone for a while and come back to it, right? And so they convinced me that whatever my mother and I both had, and whatever conditions that we were in, I should show someone, let somebody read this stuff, right? And so they convinced me. So the first step of sort of walking out of this dark tunnel was this. I was so ashamed of what my mother and I had that I was. But anyway, I sent it out to this wonderful editor who lives in Hawaii and had edited many books sort of involving spirituality, life, healing. Is actually a licensed therapist himself. So that was helpful. And then together they found a publisher. And so when the publisher started getting involved, and then they tried to tell me to publish what I have and see where I will be at. And then, so it was, in hindsight, very methodical. It was a process that I slowly saw myself walking out of and start to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, and it sounds like instrumental to that process was the presence of other people. You weren't alone anymore.
Yeah. Okay. I wish I knew that. I wish I knew that. If I knew what I know now, I would have done things very differently, of course, in 2014. And at the same time, if I knew what I know now, I probably wouldn't do it.
I totally get that. Yeah, that's one of those things that you get involved in something like that. And anything we're creating and we're putting our heart into, you get about midway into it and you're like, should I be doing this? Am I the person to do this? Is this too heavy? And I think that is the creative process of like, you are really, it's a labor of love at that point.
Yes. At various different periods of time, I thought about it that way. Right. But again, the overall process was extremely exhausting and physically, mentally, emotionally. But now that I'm done, I have more time to reflect. Of course, it was a very active process for me, a healing process. Of course, I didn't think that way back in 2018.
Well, and I want to hear more about this redemptive aspect because I know that some of your friends that came alongside of you were people that you knew well, but then there was maybe a friend who maybe you never met, but her story inspired you. Could you tell me a little bit about how Iris Chang inspired you as you were going through this process?
Yeah, so that was another tidbit. So I obviously have a lot of friends in the chemistry world, and many of them knew that I was leaving chemistry, and then also knew that I was going to undertake this task of completing my mother's memoir. And some of them found out what was going on with me back in 2018 and 19. And then one of them told me the story about Iris Chan, right? Of course, that was a person I never met. She's an American journalist and author, wrote a book about Nanking Massacre during World War II when Imperial Japanese armies occupied Nanking, which was the capital at the time of China. They just slaughtered 500,000 to 1 million more people, in cold blood, executed them. These are all civilians. And then I think writing that book and then later on going around talking about that book, promoting that book, and she met with a lot of resistance admitting that part of history, especially in Japan. And then she became very depressed, and then later on she committed suicide. And that was very powerful for me because I read about her struggles and some of these old friends of mine and told me some details about her stories. And that's where I came to the conclusion that I was going to die too. And I didn't want to.
Yeah.
I was on these antidepressant stuff. So, and that's a slippery slope. Totally slippery slope. And that was when I got up and picked up the phone, called my therapist.
Do you think
I think that will be someone totally unrelated to me and to the story. But I learned that I think I finally acknowledged the fact that I was in depression and I was depressed. Though I appreciate someone like Iris, right, woke me up. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why our stories are so important, because regardless of what happens in our lives, that can encourage people. It can be redemptive, even if we think we don't have anything to say. And Iris's story really, it sounds like it motivated you. It sounds like it helped you through a rock bottom moment to where you said, okay, this is where I'm at. I want to make a decision now.
Right. I understood that dredging up your past or dredging up a painful history of anyone's past is a terrible process. It's a process can definitely reduce your lifespan. Yeah.
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 And it sounds like a very brave thing to do. It sounds, because a lot of us, we don't want to face our past. I mean, we love denial, whether we accept that or we deny it. We love denial, and you weren't going to let denial win. And so describe to me kind of what was that journey like when you're writing these situations that happened in your mother's life, these situations that ultimately impacted you. Tell me a little bit more about the journey and tell me a little bit more about the book.
Yes. So my mother's memoir, even though it comes in 3 volumes, but really representing 2 distinctly different periods of her life. The first part I often tell people is it will sound more like Forrest Gump. She was born in 1931 during one of the biggest flood known to Chinese history or in the 20th century, right? It was one of the worst natural disasters, killing upwards of 4 million people. Wow. But she somehow miraculously lived and got adopted by American medical missionaries who were working at the time along the river and set up these refugee camps. And her biological mom found them. And so I guess my American grandparents adopted my mom when she was about 10 months old. So then she grew up she lived an idyllic childhood. And during the World War II time, she lived in Yonkers, New York. She and her parents came back to the States. But then the Korean War broke out after she and her parents went back to China after World War II. After a few years, the Korean War broke out in 1950. And I guess my American grandparents were driven out of China. And my mother was trapped in China for 30 years. Essentially, although she's Chinese, essentially as a Chinese American, right? She grew up surrounded by Westerners, English-speaking people, and her Americanness was thoroughly affirmed when she was living in Yonkers and attending schools. And so those 30 years became the second part of her life, which I often tell people it resembles the movie or the book, Schindler's List. There were many people who came out of woodwork and helped her out. knowing that she wasn't necessarily from here, even though she's Chinese, but she was essentially a foreigner in her own birth country, witnessing all kinds of atrocities that took place under the communist regime. And then, of course, leading to 1980 that she fled brought me to America, even though we came out legally. We had our passport and visa to come to America, but fleeing would be an appropriate word at that time. So there were many stories littered along her childhood, her 30 years in China, until I was born in the mid-1960s. The 1960s and 70s, of course, China went through a tumultuous cultural revolution. And so, yeah, all those things started to add up, right? Some I remember I sort of inherited my mother's photographic memory a little bit. But of course, many stories I wouldn't, even if I remember, I won't understand the magnitude, right, of those stories. And she will have these notes, and then people I interviewed, including my own father. I mean, even when I was interviewing those people for these stories, to fill in the gap for her memoir, I think I was already depressed listening to them. Just like Iris Chen, she interviewed many, many Japanese soldiers, trying to figure out what happened in 1938 and 19. So again, drudging up the past can be deadly.
What did you learn about dredging up the past? Because I think so many of us avoid it and so many of us ruminate on it. You know, there's like two distinct camps. What did you learn as you were doing this that you think is going to be helpful in your life now moving forward?
I guess there are multiple fronts. From one perspective, I think I'm glad my mother's memoir is done because it contains so much about history, Chinese history, modern history, history about America, history about this world. If we pay more attention to our history, then there is hope that we won't repeat history. And then dredging up the past, even though what we lived through might be painful, but the fact that we lived through these events, that implies that there had been a lot of wonderful human beings, extraordinary human beings who had helped us, starting from her adopted American parents who were missionaries at the time in impoverished China, helping many people in dire strait. So ultimately, I think the pain of dredging up the past was just worthwhile in some ways because we put everything in perspective with a historical backdrop and accentuated the people that she had the fortune to encounter, the people who helped her, carrying her through some of the worst time in human history.
We're back at this idea of recognizing the people around us. And as we're talking about redemption, it seems to be this beautiful thing that oftentimes with redemption, there are other people involved. As you were talking about your mother's story reflecting the history of China, it reminded me of someone I met in the Bronx once. This person was asked, they were doing this kind of study of the neighborhood. And they said, what are the cultural artifacts of your community? And he said, my mom is a cultural artifact. And people were like, what? And he goes, you need to understand, everyone who grew up in my neighborhood has been to my mom's house. She has made them food. She has been the safe place. She is known in the neighborhood. And that's what kept coming to my mind is we often see history through the lens of who won and who lost, what big event happened, but we lose sight of the people. And as you are talking about this book that you wrote, that you took great pains to write, literally, you're bringing it back to that individual story because stories have their worth because human lives are involved. And so how did you rescue this story from the pages of history, in a sense?
I guess I will give my mom the credits. And again, she's an ordinary human being, right? But the events that she encountered or experienced, historical events that she experienced, and then the people she encountered, met, or interacted with are absolutely unordinary, it's not extraordinary. And she had a conversation with me back in the early 1980s. She said, you know what, Richard, I'm actually terrible at history. I won't even try to pretend to be an amateur historian. So how about I would just minimize the historical part and just let them percolate in the background and let me focus on people. So then she just talked about people, kind of like what you just told me about that story. That woman, I think in many ways lived through an extraordinary life because all the people that went to her house, right? So it's like her too. She was a magnet. My mother was a magnet for these people. As she just accentuated the conversations with these people, the interactions with these people, even though when one reads it, one understands that there are terrifying events are ongoing in the background. But then there's these conversations about food, about cooking, about patients. My mother became a physician, an ophthalmologist. And so about things that happen in the hospital with patients. Yes, that's how. So I followed her blueprint.
It's funny. We are so quick to try to just push through challenges. And this conversation, we keep coming back to people, other people, the need for other people in our life. Even when your mother is telling her story, right? Like she's focusing on other people and she's focusing on these moments. And I love that. You were talking about them going out to eat and them, it's just, I think we're hungry for experiences. We're hungry for the stories of others because we want a guide. We want someone to show us that what we're processing right now is not going to be in the forefront of our mind forever. Like at some point, we can move past it. And I love this. As you're telling your mother's story, this is a beautiful thing to me because she recognized that. And as you were processing her story, you recognized that.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me wonder, like, what led her to write the book in the first place?
I guess, yeah. So after we arrived in the States, whoever she spoke with and told her stories to would say, "Oh, you gotta put them down on paper, and this could be a great book." And of course, I was telling you earlier that my American side of family, many of them are accomplished authors, so they were encouraging her to do so. And again, it took her a while to convince herself that it's worthwhile, again, dredging up the past and write all these stories. Because she actually then recognized she could use this memoir to remember all these people, to honor many of them. So she began her journey. This will be back in 1980, 81, 82. She began writing.
Yeah, there's this contrasting theme of isolation and community, and I love it because both of you wanted to honor other people, and I think that's important. I feel like I keep coming back to that idea because that's an incredible thing. You finish the book, and you start to get the book out there. What's that process been like for you?
Very interesting learning process. It's a fantastic learning process. And again, when the last volume came out, now about 2 years ago, a little less than 2 years ago, I thought I was done. Right, this is it. So I'm going to go do something else. But of course, at that time, I couldn't see myself sitting down writing any more books. Definitely not memoirs. But I thought I thought I was done until my editor / agent and the publisher said, "No, you got to start promoting this. This will be late 2023 or early last year." And then you ask me what I enjoy doing this because I'm learning so many different things, new things. AKA right now talking to you, this is totally new to me, right? Of course, I've done a few now. The point is that it's a great experience talking to people. It's not just promoting my mother's stories or memoir, but just conversations that will allow me to also learn from other people and see what they're thinking about, what they want to know. And and in the process, I've been writing a lot of short essays, not these long memoirs, but short essays and stories. And I realized maybe that's what I want to do from here on, at least for periods of time. Um, and just, focusing on individual small events or short events that I've encountered in my life. Uh, So I think, yeah, it's been a very rewarding process for the past 12 months, I guess, promoting this memoir.
Well, as you were writing the book, did some things come to mind of like, oh, this is why I'm this way? Or, did it really like, could you see your mother's life and how that influenced you to become who you are? Not only negatively, because I feel like that's where we start, but also positively, like how that was formative for you.
That's great. That's a great question. I think that goes into the part of acknowledging the process as being redemptive or healing is in part finding out who I am, who I was. And I think I left China abruptly. I think most of my classmates at the time in junior high didn't know what happened to me. I just disappeared from my classroom and I was uprooted by my mother. And then we were on this Pan Am flight and she was telling me everything about her past, just totally shocked me. And I had no idea that she was brought up Americans and then lived in America. And so after we landed, my mother stopped speaking Chinese to me and I didn't know a word of English. And my mother then told me that from here on, your goal is you only have one mission to become American.
Wow.
You have to speak English. You have to speak it well. And so for the next 20 years, that was my only mission. And it was tunnel vision, right? And to become an all-American if I can, to catch up with the culture, its history, and so on. And then somewhere along late 1990s, I had made this U-turn, right? And to the point where I began to visit China, visit Asia, visit other parts of the world. I finally got my American passport and I left America, right? And so I started to realize, wait a minute, who am I? Became a question. And after taking over my mother's memoir, of course, I traveled to China many times, tried to interview people, figuring out the part of history I was not very familiar with. And the more so I recognized, wait a minute, I'm actually neither. I'm neither American nor Chinese because I couldn't speak Chinese properly by then. I've forgotten all about its history. I had to relearn all of that. And so, when you tell people you're bilingual, actually, that could imply that you have none, right? And or you say you have two cultures, it also implies that you have none. So then became, so for the next 20 years, I was, for the past 20 years, I was trying to become more Chinese-like, right? So now I'm at a crossroad again after, right, 45 years in America, 20 some, however you want to split it. I'm half and half. But the book told me that working on the book told me that I should not forget my heritage, my past, and because that's always going to be part of me, influence how I think and how I behave. And my mother wasn't wrong telling me to be assimilated to this culture as quickly as I can, as quickly as I could. But at the same time, she wasn't right to tell me to forget where I came from and who I was. So this book was good in that sense.
Wow. I mean, yeah, we're talking about assimilation here. And in a sense, your mom's saying you need to forget what was behind and move forward to this American dream, this new beginning, new life. But you felt like you were between worlds. I love how you said, I didn't feel like either of them. And
Yeah.
we don't think about that when we go into another culture. We don't think about the stress that will have on us. And the people who are already in that culture may not see people who are new to the area as dealing with things that are different, because when you've been in the water a long time, you don't know it's cold. Your body is acclimated. And then other people come in and they're experiencing everything for the first time. And so what was it like to deal not only with that cultural stress, but on the other end of it, what was it like to become who you know yourself to be now?
Yeah. Stressful, I guess. word. And the kind of stress that I guess I wasn't, you know, hey, how would I put this? I think again, after we landed in JFK, for the next 20 years, I was so driven, right? I was so focused. And to the point where I completely, totally believed I was just this all American, like what my mother had hoped for. You cannot blame her because she was raised by Americans, right? English was her first language, and she lived in America, and she was surrounded by Westerners. Even in China, she attended English-speaking schools, right? But for me, I wasn't her. If I were like her for my life in America, it would be more like her life for 30 years in China. She was a foreigner in her own birth country. And of course, I was the total foreigner in America, right? Because I'm not white. But I didn't think any of that until late 90s when I began to travel, until writing the memoir. I suddenly, wait a minute. Actually, I couldn't be far from the truth. I'm Chinese. And she was American. She always thought, not any hyphenated Americans. She told me she was American, period. And now I'm thinking, wait a minute, am I this hyphenated American or am I Chinese? I'm not so sure. Again, I'm not so sure who I am, and which sounded like, wait a minute, didn't this memoir settle that? Well, no, didn't settle that, but it's good. It's good to think about that. To the point where I regret I never thought about that for the first 20 years of my life in America. Until the last 20 some years, especially last 10 or 12, I realized this is something interesting and something worth my time to consider and to think about, and to struggle with.
Richard, in these last moments, you've got me thinking, right? Like, you've got me thinking about identity.
Yes.
And so much of your mother's story is about identity. So much of your story is about identity. And how would you encourage our listeners to process their own thoughts about their identity?
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. It's about identity. It's about being a migrant in a different culture, where you abandon your mother tongue, your motherland. And I was telling a lot of people that no one will be in their right mind to do any of this, to leave their motherland, abandon their mother tongue, unless they're fleeing something. Right?
Yeah.
Persecution, war, atrocities. And so in terms of identity, I think I don't know the answer to that question, except from my own experience, I understand now a little bit that you have to acknowledge who you are first, and then try to figure out who you really are. And may take a lifetime, and you may never figure it out. And that's okay too. Sometimes it's okay to live with ambiguity. And I think that's where I'm at. I'm fairly ambiguous about who I am. But I'm glad, because to me, that's progress. That's progress versus 20 some years ago. It's not like I don't want to be American. I don't believe in American dreams. I want to be American. I want to succeed in American dreams. But the point is that definition of being American and definition of achieving that dream can be very different for many different people. Right. So now we have to slowly figure it out as we go. But the first step is acknowledging that, wait a minute, I came from here, and this is my starting point.
Because at that point, you're no longer running. At that point, you're facing it.
I like that. Just like 2018, when I picked up the phone and called my therapist, I stopped running. I recognized, I acknowledged, I understood. And so, yeah. So I think writing this memoir, or completing this memoir for my mother was healing and redemptive in a way that I recognize. I don't need to hide the fact that I was born in China. I came here as a teenager. I struggled through 20 some years learning English and American culture and history. And I spent the next 20 years relearning Chinese culture and history, and completing this memoir, and here I am. Wow.
And I think there's someone listening. You're thinking through, do you belong? Who are you? And I think we both want to encourage you. It's okay to stop running. You can acknowledge where you are and trust the process.
Right. I love what you said.
Richard, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Raleigh. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too.